Derek sat at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, sorting through the usual stack of mail. Bills, advertisements, some magazine he never remembered subscribing to. Then he saw it. A thick, cream-colored envelope with certified mail stamped across the front in bold red letters. The return address made him pause. Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. He tore it open, expecting maybe some notice about the annual meeting or a reminder about trash collection schedules. Instead, what he found made him actually laugh out loud. The letter was 2 pages long, printed on fancy letterhead and absolutely dripping with legal language. But the main point was crystal clear. The HOA was billing him $2,500 for what they called excessive vehicle violations and neighborhood aesthetic degradation. Derek read it again, slower this time. According to the letter, his property at 847 Maple Ridge Drive had been under observation for the past 6 months. They'd documented multiple vehicles parked in his driveway and along the street. The letter included timestamps and dates like they'd been running some kind of surveillance operation. They claimed these vehicles were creating an eyesore, reducing property values, and violating Section 12.4 of the Community Guidelines, which apparently limited properties to 2 visible vehicles at any given time. The letter went on to explain that he had 15 days to pay the fine, plus a $200 administrative fee for the investigation and documentation process. If he failed to pay, they'd place a lien on his property and potentially pursue legal action. It was signed by someone named Mrs. Thornberry, who held the title of HOA President and Compliance Director. Derek set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, grinning. This was going to be interesting. What Mrs. Thornberry and her little board didn't know, what nobody in the neighborhood seemed to have figured out, was that Derek didn't just own 847 Maple Ridge Drive, he owned 849, and 851, and 853. In fact, he owned every single house on the entire street, all 12 of them. It had started 3 years ago when the housing market in Pinewood Estates took a nosedive. The subdivision had been built in the early 2000s during the boom, marketed as an upscale community for young professionals. But then the factory on the edge of town closed, taking about 3,000 jobs with it. People started moving away, looking for work in bigger cities. Houses sat empty. Prices dropped. Derek had been working in real estate investment for about a decade at that point, mostly small apartment buildings and duplexes in the city. But when he saw what was happening in Pinewood Estates, he recognized an opportunity. These were solid houses, well built, in a decent area. The problem wasn't the properties themselves. It was just temporary economic trouble. So he started buying. The first house came up at a foreclosure auction. He got it for less than half of what it would have sold for 5 years earlier. Then another homeowner, desperate to relocate for a new job, accepted his cash offer. Then another. The original owners were so relieved to find a buyer, any buyer, that nobody asked too many questions. Derek used different LLCs for the purchases, keeping everything legal and above board, but maintaining his privacy. Within 2 years, he'd acquired the entire street. Some he renovated and rented out to families. A couple he let property managers stay in at reduced rent in exchange for keeping an eye on the other properties. One he kept as his primary residence. It was a good setup. The tenants were reliable. The rent covered his mortgages and then some. And he was building long-term equity in a neighborhood that he believed would bounce back eventually. The cars the HOA was complaining about belonged to his tenants and their families. Normal people living normal lives. A nurse who worked night shifts and parked her sedan in the driveway. A family with teenage kids who had their first cars. His property manager who drove a truck for his side business on weekends. Nothing excessive, nothing junked or broken down. Just regular vehicles belonging to people who lived there. Derek picked up the letter again and reread the part about reducing property values. That was rich. He probably had more invested in this neighborhood's property values than everyone on the HOA board combined. He'd poured money into updating these houses, keeping them maintained, finding good tenants who took care of the places. Meanwhile, he'd seen the HOA common areas looking shabby. The community pool closed more often than it was open, and the promised neighborhood improvements from last year's fee increase never materializing. He'd been to one HOA meeting when he first moved in, just to get a feel for how things worked. It had been an experience. Mrs. Thornberry ran the meeting like a military operation, but not in an efficient way. more like someone on a power trip with a gavel. They'd spent 45 minutes arguing about what color one homeowner could paint their front door. Someone else got lectured for putting their trash cans out the night before pickup instead of the morning of. It was petty stuff, the kind of small-time authority that some people apparently lived for. Derek hadn't gone back. He paid his regular HOA dues on time, kept his properties maintained, and stayed under the radar. Or so he thought. Apparently, they'd noticed the cars. What they hadn't noticed was that all those houses they were driving past to document his violations were also his. He thought about calling them right away, straightening it out with a simple phone call. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the tone of the letter, so formal and threatening. Maybe it was remembering that HOA meeting and how they'd treated people. Or maybe he was just curious to see how far they'd actually take this. Derek decided to wait. He wouldn't ignore the letter completely. That would be irresponsible. But he wouldn't respond right away either. He'd let them make the next move. In the meantime, he'd start pulling together all his property documents just in case things got interesting. He finished his coffee and tucked the letter into his home office file. His phone buzzed with a text from one of his tenants at 8:53, asking if he'd received any weird mail from the HOA. Apparently, they'd put notices on several of the doors too, warning the residents that the property owner was in violation and that there might be consequences. Derek texted back reassuring them that everything was fine, not to worry about it. He'd handle the HOA. He just didn't mention exactly how he planned to handle it yet. That part was still forming in his mind. But he was starting to get an idea. This was going to be more fun than he'd had in a long time. Mrs. Thornberry wanted to play enforcement officer and make an example out of a problem property owner. She had no idea she was about to learn a very expensive lesson about checking your facts before you start throwing around threats. Derek pulled out his laptop and started a new folder. He labeled it HOA Situation and began organizing documents. Property deeds, mortgage papers, rental agreements, photos of the well-maintained houses, records of all his HOA dues payments over the years. Everything neat and documented just the way he liked it. Let them send their next letter. He'd be ready, and when the time was right, when they dug themselves in deep enough, he'd show them exactly who they were messing with. Sometimes the best response isn't immediate. Sometimes you let people reveal who they really are first. Then you act. 2 weeks passed, and Derek almost forgot about the HOA letter. Almost. He'd been busy dealing with a plumbing issue at one of the rentals and interviewing a potential new tenant for the house at the end of the street. Life went on as usual. Then the second letter arrived. This one wasn't asking anymore. It was telling. The envelope was even thicker than the first, and when Derek opened it, he found a notice of lien intent along with an updated fine that had somehow grown to $5,000. They'd added late fees, additional administrative costs, and something called a non-compliance escalation charge. The letter stated that he had 10 days to pay in full or they'd proceed with placing a lien on his property and pursuing legal remedies, but that wasn't even the best part. Attached to the letter was a notice about an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for that Thursday evening. The agenda had exactly one item listed: addressing the ongoing violations at 847 Maple Ridge Drive and similar properties. They were literally holding a meeting about him, or what they thought was just him. Derek marked the date in his calendar. He wouldn't miss this for anything. He didn't tell them he was coming. He didn't announce himself. He just decided to show up and watch the show. Sometimes the best way to understand what you're dealing with is to let people talk when they think you're not listening. Thursday evening came, and Derek drove to the community center at the entrance of the subdivision. It was a small building, nothing fancy, with a meeting room that could hold maybe 50 people. When he walked in at 7 o'clock, there were already about 20 residents scattered in the folding chairs. He recognized a few faces from around the neighborhood but didn't know most of them by name. He took a seat in the back row, off to the side. Nobody paid him much attention. A few people nodded politely, the way you do with strangers in a community setting. He nodded back and settled in to observe. At 7:15, Mrs. Thornberry walked to the front of the room. She was probably in her early 60s, dressed in a business suit like this was a corporate boardroom instead of a neighborhood meeting. She had that air about her. The kind of person who'd found a small kingdom to rule and took the job very seriously. She called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of a gavel. Actual gavel. Derek had to suppress a smile. 4 other board members sat at the table with her, looking various degrees of interested and bored. She launched into the meeting without any small talk. "We're here tonight to address a serious issue affecting our community," she began, her voice carrying that tone of someone who practiced their speeches in the mirror. "For months now, we've been monitoring a situation that threatens the very character of Pinewood Estates. I'm talking, of course, about the property at 847 Maple Ridge Drive." She clicked a button, and a projector screen behind her lit up with photos. Derek's house, his driveway, the street in front of his properties. She'd really committed to this. The photos showed various cars parked at different times of day. Nothing unusual, just normal vehicles. A Honda here, a Ford truck there, someone's older Chevy. Regular cars that regular people drove. "As you can see," Mrs. Thornberry continued, using a laser pointer like she was presenting evidence at a trial, "this property has become a magnet for excessive vehicles. On any given day, we're seeing 4, 5, sometimes 6 cars associated with this single address. It's creating a parking situation that's unacceptable for a community of our caliber." One of the board members, a thin man with glasses, chimed in. "We've documented 14 different vehicles over a 6-month period. 14 from one house." Derek bit his tongue. Those 14 vehicles belonged to people living in his 12 houses, but they didn't know that. He wondered if they'd even checked who owned the other properties on that street. Apparently not. Mrs. Thornberry clicked to another slide. "But it's not just about parking. It's about what this represents. When we allow one property owner to flout the rules, to turn a blind eye to community standards, we open the door to degradation. Property values decline. The neighborhood reputation suffers. Soon we'll have more problems, more violations, more properties that look like, well..." She gestured at the photos with obvious distaste. A woman in the 3rd row raised her hand. "Have you talked to the owner?" "What do they say?" "We've sent multiple notices," Mrs. Thornberry replied, her voice tight. No response. Complete disregard for the community. This is exactly the kind of absentee landlord behavior that destroys neighborhoods. Someone buys a property, probably as an investment, rents it out to whoever, and doesn't care about the people who actually live here and care about maintaining standards. Derek found that particularly interesting. He lived right there on the street. He saw his tenants regularly, knew their names, helped them when they had issues. But in Mrs. Thornberry's mind, he'd already been cast as the villain. The outsider. The problem. Another board member, a woman with short gray hair, spoke up. "I've driven by that property several times myself. The cars are one thing, but have you seen the people coming and going? I'm not saying anything specific, but it's clear we're dealing with a different demographic than what this neighborhood was designed for." The room got quiet for a second. Derek felt his jaw tighten. There it was. The real issue wasn't really about cars at all. It was about who was driving them. His tenants included a Hispanic family, a black nurse who worked doubles at the hospital, a young couple who both worked retail. Good people. People who paid their rent on time and took care of their homes. But to this board, they were the wrong demographic. Mrs. Thornberry moved quickly past that comment, but Derek noticed she didn't correct it either. "The point is," she said, "we need to take decisive action. The board has already voted to increase the fine to $5,000 and authorized our attorney to begin lien proceedings if payment isn't received within 10 days. But I wanted to bring this to the community because you all deserve to know that we're protecting your property values. We're not going to let one bad apple spoil the whole barrel." A few people nodded in agreement. Someone actually clapped. Derek couldn't believe what he was hearing. They were acting like he was running some kind of problem property when in reality, he'd invested more money and care into that street than anyone. "Are there any questions?" Mrs. Thornberry asked, looking satisfied with herself. Derek raised his hand. He didn't plan to reveal anything yet, but he was curious how she'd respond to a simple question. Mrs. Thornberry looked surprised to see someone in the back wanting to speak. She nodded at him. "I was just wondering," Derek said, keeping his voice casual and curious. "What happens if someone owns more than one property on a street? Do the vehicle limits apply per person or per property?" Mrs. Thornberry frowned, clearly not expecting that question. "Per property, obviously. Each address is subject to the same rules, but I'm not sure how that's relevant to this situation." "Just curious," Derek said with a shrug. "Seems like if someone owned multiple houses on the same street, The cars from all those properties might park nearby, right? That wouldn't really be one property's problem. That's a hypothetical that doesn't apply here, Mrs. Thornberry said dismissively. This is a single problem property with a single absentee owner who's creating multiple violations. Next question. Someone else asked about the timeline for the legal action, and Mrs. Thornberry explained that their attorney was already preparing the paperwork. She expected the lien to be filed within 2 weeks if the owner didn't pay. She seemed almost excited about it, like this was her moment to show the neighborhood that she meant business. The meeting wrapped up after about 45 minutes. As people filed out, Derek heard conversations around him. Some people seemed uncomfortable with how aggressive the board was being. Others fully supported it, talking about keeping the neighborhood nice and not letting standards slip. A few mentioned they'd noticed the cars too and were glad someone was finally doing something about it. Derek walked to his car and sat there for a moment thinking. He'd given them a clear opportunity to consider that they might not have the full picture. He'd practically handed them the answer. But Mrs. Thornberry had dismissed it without even checking. She was so sure of herself, so certain she was right, that she hadn't done the basic homework. He pulled out his phone and called his attorney. They'd worked together on several real estate deals over the years, and Derek trusted him. When he answered, Derek filled him in on the situation. The letters, the meeting, everything. "So what do you want to do?" his attorney asked. "For now, let's respond formally but keep it minimal. Don't reveal that I own all the properties yet. Just challenge their authority to levy these fines and request documentation of their legal standing. Let's see how they react when they face actual legal pushback. You're poking the bear." "Maybe," Derek admitted. "But this bear needs poking. Did you hear what I told you about that comment? About demographics? That's not just bad HOA management. That's discrimination hiding behind parking rules. I want to see how deep this goes before I show them who they're actually dealing with." His attorney agreed to draft a response and send it first thing Monday morning. Derek drove home passing his houses on Maple Ridge Drive. Lights were on in the windows. Families were having dinner, watching TV, living their lives. These were good home. Monday morning, Derek's attorney sent the formal response to the HOA. It was professional, measured, and gave away nothing. The letter challenged the legitimacy of the fines, requested copies of all relevant bylaws and documentation, showing proper board authorization, and asked for proof that the vehicle limits were being enforced equally across the entire community. It didn't mention that Derek owned multiple properties. It simply treated the matter as what it claimed to be, a property owner responding to unreasonable charges. Derek figured that would buy some time while his attorney did deeper research into the HOA's operations. What they found over the next few days was fascinating in the worst way possible. The HOA's financial records, which were supposed to be available to all homeowners, were a mess. When his attorney requested them, it took 3 processing fees and nearly a week to get incomplete copies. What they did receive showed some interesting patterns. The HOA collected dues from everyone in the subdivision, about 150 homes total. That should have added up to a decent budget for maintenance, improvements, and operations, but the expenses told a different story. There were regular charges to a landscaping company owned by Mrs. Thornberry's son-in-law. The community pool that was rarely open still had a monthly management fee going to a company that, when Derek's attorney looked into it, was registered to another board member. Legal fees were unusually high for an HOA that size, and those fees went to an attorney who happened to be Mrs. Thornberry's neighbor and close friend. It wasn't exactly embezzlement. Everything was technically documented, but it was definitely a tight little circle of people using HOA funds to benefit themselves and their connections. The kind of thing that happens when a small group gets control and nobody's really paying attention. Derek's attorney also found something else. The vehicle restrictions they were citing, the ones in Section 12.4 of the community guidelines, had actually been challenged and ruled unenforceable by a court in a nearby county about 8 years ago. Similar HOA, similar rules. And a judge had determined that HOAs couldn't place such restrictive limits on legal vehicles parked on private property or public streets. The ruling wasn't directly binding on Pinewood Estates, but it set a precedent that would make their case very shaky if it went to court. They probably don't even know about that ruling, his attorney told Derek over the phone, or they're hoping you don't know about it. So basically they're threatening me with fines and liens based on rules they can't actually enforce? That's about the size of it. And if we wanted to push back hard right now, we probably could, but you said you wanted to see how far they'd go. Derek did want that, because this wasn't just about the money or the rules anymore. He'd watched that meeting. He'd heard the comments about demographics and different types of people. He'd seen how Mrs. Thornberry operated, with her power trips and her assumptions. This was about exposing a system that was broken and possibly discriminatory. But then things escalated in a way he didn't expect. That Thursday he got a call from one of his tenants, Rita, the nurse who lived at 849. She sounded upset. "Did you see what they put on the door?" she asked. Derek hadn't been by that property in a couple of days. "What did they put on the door?" "A big red notice. It says the property is in violation and under review for potential legal action. My neighbors saw it. My kids are embarrassed. They made it sound like we're doing something wrong, like we're criminals or something." Derek felt his anger rising. It was one thing to send letters to him. It was another thing entirely to put notices on his tenants' doors, making them feel unwelcome in their own homes. "Rita, I'm sorry. This is completely out of line. I want you to know that you and your family haven't done anything wrong. This is between me and the HOA, and they have no right to harass my tenants. I just don't understand what we did. We park our cars in the driveway like normal people. We keep the yard clean. We've never had any complaints before. You didn't do anything. Trust me, I'm handling this, okay? Don't let them make you feel bad. You're a great tenant and this is your home." After hanging up with Rita, Derek drove over to Maple Ridge Drive. Sure enough, there were bright red notices on the doors of several of his properties. Not all of them, which was interesting. They'd targeted the ones with the most visible cars or the ones where his tenants looked different from the old guard in the neighborhood. He took photos of every notice. Then he called his attorney again. "They're harassing my tenants now, putting notices on their doors. This has gone too far." His attorney agreed. "That might actually work in our favor. If they're targeting specific properties based on who lives there, that's discrimination. We could make a case for that." "I don't want to make a case," Derek said. "Not yet. What I want is to set up a meeting. Face to face. I want to sit down with Mrs. Thornberry and her board and give them one chance to back off before I show them exactly what they're dealing with." "You sure?" "We could just hit them with everything right now. I'm sure. I believe in giving people a chance to do the right thing, even when they probably won't take it." The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the HOA office. Derek, his attorney, and the 5 board members. Mrs. Thornberry had readily agreed when his attorney called, probably thinking this was her chance to intimidate the problem property owner into paying up. Derek spent the weekend preparing. He gathered every property deed, every mortgage document, every piece of paper that proved what he owned. He made copies of all the notices they'd put on doors. He had his attorney pull together the information about the questionable financial practices and the court precedent about vehicle restrictions. He also did something else. He talked to each of his tenants, explained what was happening, and asked if any of them had experienced any direct discrimination or harassment beyond the door notices. 2 of them had stories. One family had been stopped by a board member while unloading groceries and questioned about whether they were really supposed to be there. Another tenant had been told by a neighbor that your kind usually didn't live in neighborhoods like this. Derek documented everything, not because he wanted to destroy these people, but because he wanted them to understand the real consequences of their actions. They thought they were protecting property values. What they were actually doing was making good people feel unwelcome based on prejudice. Monday night, Derek barely slept. He kept thinking about how to handle the meeting. Part of him wanted to walk in and immediately dump all the property deeds on the table, shock and awe. But another part of him, the part that had learned patience in real estate over the years, knew that timing mattered. Tuesday afternoon came. Derek put on a suit, something he rarely did. He wanted to look professional, serious. His attorney met him at the HOA office 15 minutes early. They sat in the parking lot reviewing their strategy one more time. "You ready for this?" his attorney asked. Derek looked at the building, then at the papers in his briefcase. "Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go see if Mrs. Thornberry is as confident when she's sitting across from us as she was standing at that podium." They walked into the building together. The meeting room was smaller than the one they'd used for the community meeting. Just a conference table with 8 chairs. Mrs. Thornberry was already there, along with the 4 other board members. They had their own papers spread out, probably their documentation of all the supposed violations. Mrs. Thornberry stood up when they entered, extending her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for coming. I'm glad we can finally sit down and resolve this matter like adults." Derek shook her hand. Her grip was firm, assertive. She was still operating under the assumption that she held all the cards. He took his seat across from her, his attorney beside him. The briefcase sat on the floor next to his chair. He didn't open it yet. "So," Mrs. Thornberry began, folding her hands on the table in front of her, "I assume you're here to discuss the outstanding fines and how we can bring your property into compliance with community standards." Derek looked at her for a long moment. "Actually, I'm here to give you an opportunity." She blinked, clearly not expecting that response. "An opportunity? To rescind all these fines, remove the notices from my properties, and apologize to my tenants for harassment. If you do that, we can all walk away from this situation without any further issues." One of the male board members actually laughed. "You come in here owing us $5,000 in violation of multiple community standards, and you think you can make demands? That's rich." Mrs. Thornberry held up a hand to quiet him, but her expression had hardened. "I appreciate your, shall we say, confidence, but you seem to misunderstand the situation. You're in violation. We have documentation. We have authority. We're prepared to move forward with legal action if necessary. Now, if you'd like to discuss a payment plan for the fines, we're willing to be reasonable about that. But there won't be any apologies for enforcing rules that everyone else in this community follows." Derek nodded slowly. "Everyone else follows them? You're enforcing these rules equally across the entire subdivision?" "Of course we are." "Interesting. Because my attorney drove around yesterday and documented at least 15 other properties with 3 or more vehicles visible. None of them, huh?" Derek reached into his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. 12 property deeds, each one neatly organized with colored tabs. He began laying them out on the conference table one by one in a line. Each deed showed the property address clearly at the top and his name as the owner at the bottom. "But Maple Ridge Drive," he said, placing the first one down. "That's the property you sent the fine to." Mrs. Thornberry watched, her confident expression starting to shift into confusion. "Cornell Maple Ridge Drive." He placed the second deed next to the first. "That's where Rita lives, the nurse you put one of those red notices on. She's a great tenant. Works doubles at the hospital saving lives. 851 Maple Ridge Drive." Another deed joined the row. "Young couple with a baby. First-time renters. They were so excited to find a safe neighborhood." He continued, placing each deed carefully, methodically. 853, 855, 857, 859, 861, 863, 865, 867. The board members were leaning forward now, reading the documents, their faces showing the slow realization of what they were seeing. "And 869, at the end of the street." Derek placed the final deed. "That's where my property manager lives. He maintains all these houses, makes sure everything's working, handles repairs. Those 12 vehicles you documented over 6 months, they belong to the people who live in the 12 houses I own. Every single house on Maple Ridge Drive belongs to me." The room was completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Mrs. Thornberry stared at the row of deeds like they were written in a foreign language. The other board members looked at each other, then at the documents, then at Derek. The man who'd laughed earlier wasn't laughing anymore. "You're saying you own the entire street?" "Every house. Purchased them over the past 3 years. All legal, all documented with the county, all paying HOA dues on time. 12 separate properties, 12 sets of dues I pay every quarter. You want to know something interesting? That makes me the single largest property owner in Pinewood Estates by a significant margin." Mrs. Thornberry found her voice, though it had lost some of its earlier confidence. "This doesn't change the violations. Rules are rules, regardless of ownership structure." Derek's attorney slid another document across the table. "About those rules. This is a court decision from 8 years ago. Similar HOA, similar vehicle restrictions. The judge ruled them unenforceable as applied to private property and public streets. The precedent would almost certainly apply here if this went to litigation. But the bigger issue," Derek continued, "isn't really about the rules, is it? It's about enforcement. You said you enforce these rules equally, but my attorney documented 15 other properties in this subdivision with 3 or more vehicles. None of them received fines. None of them got red notices on their doors. So why were mine targeted? Mrs. Thornberry straightened in her chair, trying to regain control of the situation. We prioritize based on the severity of the situation and the impact on surrounding properties. Or based on who lives there? Derek asked quietly. I was at your community meeting. I heard the comments about demographics, about people who aren't the right fit for the neighborhood. I've talked to my tenants about how they've been treated. Being stopped and questioned. Being told that their kind doesn't usually live in places like this. Now hold on, one of the board members interjected, a woman with gray hair. No one said anything about discrimination. We're just enforcing community standards. Derek pulled out his phone and opened a voice recording app. This is Rita from 849, describing being stopped by a board member while unloading groceries. He played a clip. Rita's voice filled the room, recounting how she'd been questioned about whether she really lived there, whether she was visiting someone, told that they needed to be careful about who was coming and going in the neighborhood. He played another recording. A tenant describing being told by a neighbor, within earshot of a board member who did nothing, that this neighborhood wasn't really meant for people like them. Mrs. Thornberry's face had gone pale. We can't be held responsible for what neighbors say to each other, but you can be held responsible for selective enforcement that disproportionately targets minorities and working-class families, Derek's attorney said. That's textbook discrimination. And when you couple it with the statements made at official HOA meetings about demographics and the type of people suited for this neighborhood, you've created a documented pattern. The board members were whispering to each other now, urgent, hushed conversations. Derek could see the realization hitting them. This wasn't a simple fine dispute anymore. This was potentially a discrimination case with documentation, recordings, and witnesses. Mrs. Thornberry raised a hand to silence her board. She looked at Derek, and for the first time he saw genuine concern in her eyes. Not remorse necessarily, but concern. What exactly are you looking for here? I told you when I walked in. Rescind all the fines. Remove the notices from the doors. Issue a formal apology to my tenants for the harassment. Do that and we move forward. I'll continue paying my dues, maintaining my properties, and being a responsible member of this community. And if we agree to this, she asked carefully, then we're done here. No lawsuits, no complaints filed with fair housing authorities, no media coverage about an HOA targeting minority families in their enforcement. Everyone moves on. The gray-haired board member spoke up. This sounds like blackmail. Derek's attorney shook his head. It's not blackmail to offer to settle a dispute before pursuing legal remedies. My client is being remarkably generous considering the evidence we have. If anything, he's offering you a way out of what could become a very expensive and very public problem. Mrs. Thornberry looked at the deeds spread across the table. Derek could practically see her mind working, calculating, trying to find a way to maintain control. But there wasn't one. She'd made assumptions, acted on those assumptions, and now those assumptions had blown up in her face. We'd need to meet as a board to discuss this, she finally said. Of course, Derek replied. Take your time. But I should mention something else. He pulled out another document and slid it across the table. This is an analysis of your HOA's financial records over the past 3 years. The ones that are supposed to be available to all homeowners, but somehow require processing fees and weeks of waiting to access. Mrs. Thornberry's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the document. You'll notice some interesting patterns there. Contracts with companies owned by board members' relatives. Legal fees to attorneys who are personal friends. Management fees for facilities that are rarely operational. Now, I'm not an accountant and I'm definitely not a lawyer, so I can't say if any of that crosses legal lines. But I imagine if someone were to file a formal complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Board, they might want to take a closer look. The room had gone very quiet again. The other board members were reading over Mrs. Thornberry's shoulder, and their faces showed that they understood exactly what they were looking at. I'm not threatening you, Derek continued. I'm just making sure you understand the full picture before you make your decision. You came after my properties aggressively, without checking basic facts based on prejudices about who was living there. That was your choice, but now you have another choice to make. We can end this right here, right now, with everyone walking away, or we can escalate, and I promise you that won't end well for this board. One of the other board members, a younger man who'd been quiet until now, spoke up. Look, maybe we did move too fast on this. Maybe there were assumptions made that shouldn't have been. Can we have 24 hours to discuss this internally? Derek looked at his attorney, who nodded slightly. 24 hours is fine, but I need your word that no additional notices go up. No more harassment of my tenants, no escalation while you're deliberating. Mrs. Thornberry nodded stiffly. Agreed, no further action for 24 hours. Derek stood up, collecting his deeds and placing them back in his briefcase. His attorney gathered their documents. As they headed for the door, Mrs. Thornberry called out, "How long have you known? About the financial issues, the precedent case, all of it?" Derek turned back. "My attorney started researching the day you sent the first letter, but I only really knew I wanted to see how far you'd push this after I attended your community meeting. When I heard those comments about demographics and different types of people, I realized this wasn't about parking or property values. It was about control and prejudice. I couldn't let that stand. You set us up," she said quietly. "No, you set yourselves up. I just decided to watch it happen instead of stopping it immediately. Sometimes people need to see exactly what they're doing before they can recognize it's wrong. I'm hoping in the next 24 hours you'll recognize that." Derek and his attorney walked out of the building into the late afternoon sun. They got into Derek's car and sat there for a moment, not saying anything. Finally, his attorney broke the silence. "That was impressive. But do you really think they'll do the right thing?" "Honestly, I don't know. Mrs. Thornberry is stubborn, and admitting fault doesn't seem to be her strong suit. But I gave them the easy way out. Now it's up to them whether they take it. And if they don't?" Derek looked back at the HOA office building. "Then we do this the hard way. File complaints, pursue legal action, make everything." The call came at 9:30 the next morning. Derek was having coffee in his kitchen when his phone rang. His attorney's number showed on the screen. "They caved," his attorney said without preamble. "Complete capitulation. They're rescinding all fines, removing all notices today, and they want to schedule a formal meeting to issue an apology to your tenants." Derek felt a wave of relief wash over him. He'd been prepared for the fight, ready to escalate if necessary, but this was better, much better. All of them agreed. Even Mrs. Thornberry? She actually called me personally this morning. Said the board met last night for 3 hours. Apparently it got heated. 2 of the board members were ready to dig in and fight. But the other 3, including her, recognized they were sitting on a legal nightmare. The financial stuff particularly spooked them. She asked if you'd be willing to meet with them again. Less formal this time, to discuss reforms. Reforms? She didn't elaborate, but I got the impression they're genuinely concerned about how things have been run. Your documentation opened their eyes to some issues they'd been ignoring or hadn't noticed. She sounded, and I'm not kidding here, almost grateful that you brought it to their attention rather than just filing complaints with the state. Derek thought about that. It would have been easy to go nuclear, to destroy the board completely and watch them scramble, but that wasn't what he wanted. He wanted change, real change that would benefit everyone in the community. "Tell her I'll meet with them, but I want my property manager there too, and I want at least one of my tenants present. If we're talking about reforms, the people affected by HOA decisions should have a voice. I'll set it up." The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the community center, not in the small HOA office. When Derek arrived with his property manager and Rita, the nurse from 849, he was surprised to see not just the 5 board members, but about 15 other residents scattered around the room. Mrs. Thornberry stood up when they entered. "Thank you for coming," she said, and her tone was completely different from the first meeting. No arrogance, no condescension. She looked tired, maybe even a little humbled. "Before we begin, I want to formally apologize to Rita and to all of your tenants for the distress and harassment caused by our enforcement actions. It was inappropriate, it was excessive, and frankly, it revealed some problems in how we've been operating that need to be addressed." Rita nodded, accepting the apology with grace. Derek was proud of her for coming. She'd been hesitant at first, worried about confrontation, but he'd assured her that her voice mattered. Mrs. Thornberry continued. "We've invited other community members here because the conversation Derek initiated made us realize we've been operating in a bubble, making decisions without real input, enforcing rules inconsistently, and losing sight of what an HOA is supposed to do, which is serve the community, not control it." One of the younger board members, the one who'd asked for 24 hours, spoke next. "We've been reviewing our financials and we found some issues. Contracts that should have been put out for competitive bidding weren't. Fees that seemed standard but were actually higher than market rate. Nothing that rises to criminal conduct, but definitely not best practices. We're in the process of terminating several of those relationships and implementing new oversight procedures. Derek was impressed. They were actually doing it, actually taking this seriously. That's a good start, he said. But what about the enforcement issues? The vehicle restrictions that you've been using selectively? Mrs. Thornberry nodded. We're proposing to suspend all vehicle restrictions except for the most basic safety issues, abandoned vehicles, things actually blocking access. And we want to establish a clear appeals process for any future violations, so property owners have recourse if they disagree with an enforcement action. An older woman in the audience raised her hand. I've lived here for 12 years and I've watched this board become more and more heavy-handed. I'm glad someone finally challenged them. But how do we make sure this doesn't just happen again with the next board? That was the real question. Derek had thought about this a lot over the past few days. I have a suggestion if the board is open to it. And if the community supports it, Mrs. Thornberry gestured for him to continue. Term limits. No one serves more than 3 consecutive years on the board. That keeps fresh perspectives coming in and prevents any one group from entrenching themselves. Also, quarterly open forums where any homeowner can bring concerns or suggestions without having to file formal complaints. Make the HOA more accessible and transparent. Several people in the audience nodded. Someone else raised their hand. What about the bylaws? Some of them are from when the subdivision was first built, 20 years ago. They don't reflect how people actually live now. We should form a committee to review and update them, Rita suggested, speaking up for the first time. Get input from different residents, different age groups, families and singles, owners and renters. Make sure the rules reflect the actual community, not some idealized version from decades ago. The conversation flowed from there. Ideas, suggestions, concerns. It turned into something Derek hadn't quite expected. A genuine community discussion about how to make Pinewood Estates work better for everyone. Not just the people who'd been there the longest or the ones who fit some narrow definition of the right kind of resident. After about 90 minutes, Mrs. Thornberry called for a vote on the key proposals. Term limits for board members, suspended vehicle restrictions, quarterly open forums, and the formation of a bylaws review committee. The board members voted and all 5 raised their hands in favor. Then Mrs. Thornberry looked at Derek. There's one more thing we'd like to propose. We have 2 board seats coming up for election in 3 months. We'd like to nominate you for one of them. You clearly care about this community, you have significant investment here, and you're not afraid to challenge us when we're wrong. That's exactly what this board needs. Derek was caught off guard. He hadn't considered joining the board. His initial thought was to decline, to keep his distance and just manage his properties. But then he looked around the room. At Rita, who'd been brave enough to come today. At the other residents who'd shown up because they cared. At the chance to actually help shape things from the inside rather than just react from the outside. I'll run, he said, but only if we make one more change. Reserve at least 1 board seat specifically for renters or for representatives of rental properties. They're part of this community too, and their voices matter. Mrs. Thornberry looked at the other board members who nodded. Agreed. We'll amend the bylaws to include that provision. The meeting wrapped up shortly after, but people lingered, talking in small groups. Derek found himself in conversation with several residents he'd never met before. People who thanked him for shaking things up, for making them pay attention to how their HOA was being run. Mrs. Thornberry approached him as people were leaving. They stood there for a moment, 2 people who'd been adversaries just days ago, now on uncertain new ground. I owe you more than an apology, she said quietly. I let this position go to my head. Started thinking I was protecting the community when really I was just protecting my own vision of what the community should be. The things you revealed about our finances, about our enforcement patterns, that was embarrassing. But it needed to happen. We all make mistakes, Derek replied. What matters is what we do after we recognize them. Are you really going to run for the board? Because I meant what I said. We need people who'll push back, who won't just go along to get along. I'm really going to run. But I'm not looking to take over or make enemies. I just want to help make this neighborhood work for everyone who lives here. Not just the people who've been here longest or who look a certain way. She nodded. I understand. And for what it's worth, you have my support. 3 months later, Derek won his board seat in a landslide. Rita also ran for the seat reserved for rental representatives and won as well. Mrs. Thornberry stepped down voluntarily, deciding her 3 years were enough and that it was time for new leadership. She stayed active in the community but without the authority she'd wielded before. The changes came gradually but steadily. The Bylaws Review Committee worked for 6 months and presented updated rules that were actually enforceable and fair. The quarterly forums became popular, with residents showing up to discuss everything from playground improvements to street lighting. The HOA finances became transparent, with monthly reports posted online for anyone to see. Derek continued investing in Pinewood Estates. He bought 3 more properties over the next year, renovating them and finding good tenants. Property values did increase, but not because of strict enforcement of arbitrary rules. They increased because the neighborhood became known as welcoming, well-maintained and fairly run, a place where people wanted to live. He kept his 12 houses on Maple Ridge Drive, though he eventually sold 2 of them to the families renting them, helping them become first-time homeowners. Those families stayed now as owners instead of renters, invested in the community in new ways. The story of what happened with the HOA spread through local real estate circles. Derek got calls from other investors asking for advice about dealing with difficult HOAs. He always told the